Welcome back to our panel discussion, Predictive Intelligence, the Marriage of Data and Analytics in Cybersecurity, sponsored by TIBCO, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests today are David Bray, Chief Information Officer at the FCC, also Eisenhower Fellow to Taiwan and Australia, and Harvard Executive in Residence. Julie Ard is Senior Principal Cyber Engineer and Architect at the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, and Stephen Dennis, Data Analytics Engine Director at the Homeland Security Department's DHS Advanced Research Projects Agency. That's part of the Science and Technology Directorate. And I want to turn to the human factor here, because a couple of examples that came up in the earlier discussion about a hedge fund vice president executive was fooled by a telephone phishing attack. It wasn't even email, as David related, and that was a famous story, and they lost all their money when he gave a password out over the telephone to someone he thought was the company. And then this idea of the garlic futures, the commodity prices changing, could indicate something else happening in an entirely different domain other than demand for garlic. And so we should really talk about the human piece of this. You know, there's an old saying in the car industry that the safety engineers had: we can fix any part of the car except the nut behind the wheel. And so that kind of gets to this human factor idea. Julie, what's going on with respect to the human design engineering factor of the next generation of cyber systems?
Two things. IARPA actually has another program called CAUSE, which looks at unconventional data sources to predict cyber attacks.
That's C-O-Z or C-A-U-S-E?
C-A-U-S-E. That's relevant to this discussion about garlic futures. For the cloud security
it's like
program,
cause and effect, in other words.
Right, cause, yes. For the human factor, in the Virtue program that I've been talking about, the systems will be inherently more secure against insiders, and as we were discussing earlier, they can be accidental or intentional insiders by, for example, locking down access to certain resources, and as we were talking about the fog earlier, a local decision could be made to protect resources based on bad behavior that's being detected. So, so we very much have the human flaw in mind when we're designing our systems.
So the CAUSE project's goal is, how would you put that, to just kind of summarize?
The CAUSE project is to predict cyber attacks based on unconventional data sources.
So that could be like from phishing. Does it take into account the possibility of like a telephone call or something completely wild vector that's not on the screen in front of the person?
It's looking more at like news events.
I see.
Yeah, and dark web data.
So it's looking wide for possible vectors, I guess, of attack. Yes, Stephen, there must be similar work going on in Homeland Security that way too.
Absolutely, and so this engine concept that we've been discussing, data analytics engine, there are other engines, and so inside of HSARPA, so we have a modeling and simulation engine. We also have one that focuses on behavioral and social science. And we can actually go down the hall to our colleagues and have these discussions about how humans are going to interact with machines and get a completely different perspective than the engineering perspective we bring to the table, which is very important for good problem solving. I think that when we were mentioning earlier having the system be instrumented to the point where it can tell you what you're doing as an individual, giving you personal feedback, models could be developed that help you become a lot more effective at your job. Also having the insight into what groups are doing, how groups collaborate, what makes them productive is very important across all of the missions of DHS. And so building that into the systems, the systems we inherit today are not instrumented that way, but certainly as we move to the cloud and as we bring in more advanced computation, it's going to be easier and easier for us to take advantage of seamless interfaces with humans as part of the decision-making process. And then being able to communicate to not just the analysts, but even to the public. What risk am I taking in a certain situation is going to be important in the new paradigm. And so you have a lot more information to inform risk. How is that communicated? For example, when you buy a driverless vehicle in the future, how are you going to be aware of all the risk that you're taking when you're in one of several modes maybe that the car can support?
So that idea of the better human interaction with systems has a lot of applications cybersecurity, but I've heard of systems where eye tracking,
Yes.
as people looking at various data sources on crowded environments can help them redesign. So even for digital system design,
That's right.
there's a benefit there too.
And then it could be customized to you in the way that you think and act.
All right, David, you must see that in Taiwan, Australia, Harvard, and the FCC.
Yes, on multiple levels. So one of the conversations I had with a very high level leader in my journeys overseas said, if you want a perfect system, get rid of all the humans. And so recognizing that humans introduce interesting challenges to the
Great
system.
country, except for all those citizens out there. Right?
Something like that. So I think you have to recognize that this is an 80% people issue. It's 20% the technology, and it's hard technology, but it is 80% a people issue. And really it's about issues of both trust as well as awareness of the risk. At RSA last week, actually I'll just say at RSA because I don't know when you're going to broadcast it. At RSA, Google actually pointed out that Office email is about 6 times more likely to be targeted for phishing than home email. And so you've got individuals that are coming into the work environment that are used to their home environment, which is not really that threatening environment, and they are confused when they enter into the workplace and they find that it's much more of a battlefield of sorts. That then raises interesting questions about how do you effectively allow people to do their jobs, but also create the awareness of the risk. And that's why, again, I think we need to have something that begins to share in a way that's accessible not just to technologists, but something that is available to the public, as to say, right now your organization is experiencing a mild storm, or it's in the middle of a hurricane, or the place where you're attempting to access your work environment is very much at risk. And we don't have that information right now that's publicly available. It also raises interesting questions about how do you solve for the human factor when more and more of these devices are going to be connected at home. I'd ask you and I'd ask our listeners as to how many people have checked the last time their router's firmware was updated? And that's just your wireless access point. Mm-hmm. When you have more and more of these devices, are you going to check and make sure they have the most recent patches? Because essentially we're all going to become CIOs of our home environment. I just don't know if most of us want to do that. And so it raises interesting questions about how you bring automation to that. And when we talk about predictive intelligence, it really is that, which is basically bringing in some sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence that can point and cue when things are going wrong, but at the same time, it's not going to be able to tell you why. In some respects, AI, machine learning, is a lot like a 5-year-old, which is they'll just say, I spotted this odd pattern, or that doesn't sound right to me. But when you ask them why, it's going to require a human to dive deeper. And that actually that's an interesting opportunity, because if we can identify what your normal patterns of behaviors are, and maybe you get a phone call and it says, I'm not sure you should take that phone call. If it could explain to you why and say it looks like it's a spoof number that's trying to look like it's coming inside your organization, you're less frustrated. If you temporarily disable the CEO's account because you see that their account is being accessed from a foreign country that you don't know they're on travel to, the CIO might be mildly perturbed, but if you explain why, that the reason why was it was being accessed from another foreign country that we didn't think you were on travel about, then it actually becomes more of a two-way street. And so we need to be able to actually think about how do we pair humans with machine learning to actually make it a paired dialogue as opposed to one or the other.
I want to get back to that question about sources, as Julie brought up in the Cause project. Where are these attacks coming from? What's the developing wave of vectors and so forth? And someone mentioned the dark web, and which really the dark web is an architecture. It's not a place. And the servers are right next door to the servers that are on the indexed web. These are simply unindexed servers that you can't find easily, but they're there. And so I'm wondering, I think there's different levels of sophistication, even knowledge of the dark web and what you can learn from it among federal agencies. What are you seeing there? Stephen?
Yes, so I think the dark web is an important source of information. It's, as you mentioned, not easy to index or understand, but I think it's a very important source that shouldn't be overlooked.
I mean, Tor was developed in the Navy, so you would think the federal government should be there.
Well, and so on the other side of that, some of the architectural innovations that have happened in the dark web could have positive value and use, and we are exploring those in ways that could enhance untrusted information sharing and cryptographically certified information sharing and transactions. There's a whole wealth of opportunity on the positive side.
Yeah, so there's data there that could be analyzed along with the indexable data, the manifest data that's on the I guess, what do they call it, the surface web, or the easily accessed web.
There's several commercial companies that actually do this and provide intelligence products that can actually tip and cue if it looks like your organization is being targeted. I think what this really gets to, however, is that technology itself is amoral, that the internet, which allows most of us to do great or benign things, can also be used for less than great purposes too, such as human trafficking or cyber attacks or narcotics trafficking. And I think there's another technology out there that also deserves a sort of more deeper debate on both sides, which is encryption. I actually, in talking to people in Taiwan and Australia and then doing follow-up conversations with them, they were very confused when the whole Apple versus FBI debate happened. And that this was their observations in Taiwan and Australia, where they said, you know, one, you shouldn't ask for a key that unlocks every house. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But then two, you shouldn't design a house where one key unlocks every house. And so both sides of the issues seem to be overcomplicating the issue and actually not diving into it, which was really the case, which is, yes, you shouldn't have a key that unlocks everything, but you also shouldn't design a house where one key unlocks it as well. Think about how you can actually come up with an architecture that allows, when actual reasonable cause has been established, it's one key for one house as opposed to one for many. And I think we're going to need to talk about that because more and more of the internet is going to become encrypted. That is good because that also helps protect privacy and civil liberties, but it then raises questions about what other things are going to be hidden in the encrypted traffic that organizations aren't going to be able to see, such that if you are trying to do a cyber attack or something like that, that may not be visible to us all.
Yeah, so you need the right filters almost, if you will, to see the invisible light.
Mm-hmm. It's challenging, though, because I would actually argue that you don't really want to decrypt the encrypted traffic. That sort of breaks the model. Mm-hmm. This actually raises interesting questions about how right now, with Einstein, for the earlier versions, you did have to route all your traffic to DHS. And when you go to a cloud environment, you really don't want to route all that traffic to one place, because if you route it to one place, it defeats the whole point of cloud. And so I think we need to actually have more a sophisticated conversation. And I've seen actually, our Congress actually is proposing doing a deeper dive on digital security. And I think that's needed because right now you've got, and maybe it's just the era of our age where everything is reduced to sound bites. Both sides have merit, but really if we think about sort of imagination and creativity in design, I would submit that you can actually design something that does privacy and civil liberty protections at the same time address the security of organizations and people.
Steve, something to add?
Yeah, no, I just agree with that approach, and I think it's an important place to go. And you know, we've started looking at the blockchain as one transformational architecture that might be used for a variety of mixed trust environment information sharing applications. And I think we should continue to explore that and debate and understand these trade-offs as we go forward.
And one other thing, speaking of this whole dark web idea and use of these new technologies, and that is one of the vexing issues that we'll maybe end on and see what approaches you're thinking about, is attribution of attacks. Because there's more and more talk about maybe counterattacking in some manner that can be allowed by law and appropriate to what an agency is doing. We're not going to launch hacking attacks and so forth, but reverse types of engineering, and also, but you have to know who it is, where it's coming from, with some certainty, and that seems to never be the case. Is there anything developing in analytics that can lead to better attribution? Maybe not.
So, I would say attribution is a very thorny issue. Partly because, again, as we talked earlier, that the way TCP/IP was built, it was not built thinking about all the different uses it could be done for. And so attribution is difficult with the current TCP/IP stack. That's partly why I caution about the hackback approach, is that if you really want to do something malicious, you would make it look like party A attacked party B, and you make it look like party B attacked party A, and you'd step back and watch the mayhem ensue.
Right.
Yeah, and you just watch. I think, again, that's where maybe before we go that far, maybe we just need to first have why don't we even have a baseline of what the activities are that we can actually publicly talk about? Because if we don't have that baseline, then everything is anecdote-based, and we really need to have it much more informed by the actual data science. And so I'm excited about that. That said, again, what we've not been talking about is this is a huge change for how people work and how people work with machine learning and AI. And my concern is I don't see one, and I say this as currently as chair for the Federal Cloud Center of Excellence at GSA, I don't see a lot of public service agencies moving to the cloud, let alone moving to AI. And so my worry is if you don't move to cloud, you're not going to be able to do any of the advantages of what we just talked about here. Plus, I don't see experimentations on AI. So in some respects, we need to accelerate the push to move to cloud. And then from there, think about resiliency and AI that could actually help inform these approaches.
All right, we could probably go on for hours more, but we are at the end of the session, so I would like to take this moment to thank today's guests. David Bray is the Chief Information Officer at the FCC, also an Eisenhower Fellow to Taiwan and Australia, and Harvard Executive in Residence. Stephen Dennis is Data Analytics Engine Director at the Homeland Security Department's DHS Advanced Research Projects Agency, part of the Science and Technology Directorate. And Julie Ard is Senior Principal Cyber Engineer and Architect at the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com. Use the search term TIBCO. On behalf of Federal News Radio, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive session will be sent to you shortly. Coming up next, Matt Quinn, TIBCO's Chief Technology Officer and Executive Vice President of Products and Technology. He'll offer industry's perspective on this discussion. And if you requested a training certificate, you'll also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. Thanks again for joining us.